Hello, everyone, and welcome to Synthesis. I'm Emily Sicorsi, and this is
Justin Foster.
So Synthesis. Synthesis is a Root and River hosted webcast, bringing together nonconformist leaders whose ideas make them and us see the world a little bit differently. This is our third episode, and we're really thankful that you tuned in and joined us today. We're also really thrilled because we have an awesome guest. He's a person who's been instrumental to the growth of Root and River and influential to both of us. And we know that he's going to do the same for you, definitely influence your thinking. So our guest for our third episode of Synthesis is Cort Dial. Cort believes that the only leader who needs to change is you. He spent the last 30 years developing leaders in a variety of environments, ranging from corporate skyscrapers to South American jungles to Middle East deserts. Cort's unique approach to transforming organizations is found in his core conviction. Leaders reach the summit of leadership when they can create extraordinary business performance while caring for the people. Cort calls this new breed of 21st century hero the all-in leader, and his book, Heretics to Heroes, is one of the top-rated, independently published books for 2016, and it's received rave reviews since it was published. So Justin and I are super excited to welcome you, Cort, to Synthesis.
I would say, Cort, you are one of the folks that inspired us to do something like this. And, you know, we listen to a lot of podcasts. We're both podcast junkies. We listened to a lot of the ones that you're on. And we decided we want to do this a little bit differently. And we wanted to make it about the guest. So this is much more of a Q&A than it is maybe a traditional podcast. But I also want to point out to anyone watching this or listening to this later on, is this is the Cort, knowing Cort is the result of the power of something I learned years and years and years ago. Probably was planted in my head as a seed when I found a copy in my grandmother's closet of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence Others. And it was this idea that you treat everyone that you meet with respect. So I was introduced to a man named Mike Green, who initially I did not like in the conversation. But I remember that, and I kept listening, and we became good friends. He became a client. Then he introduced us to Cort. And I don't know that we would have ever found you, Cort, without that introduction, just the way that life worked out. And I always want to, we always, in this idea of synthesis and paradoxes, we always want to honor the random, not random occurrences that bring these relationships that we have together. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So we want to start at the beginning. In your book, Heretics to Heroes, you share some really powerful memories of your childhood, and I love the early chapters because it really gives us a sense of who you are and how you grew up. So, Cort, what do you think is your most lasting memory of your childhood?
Oh, it would have to be the day Kennedy was assassinated. That was the day where I realized that something with unbelievable potential, unbelievably positive, could go bad in an instant. And it was a wake-up call for me, I think, as a young child, to have to deal with that, to see the effect it had on my family, my parents, our community. You know, as a young Catholic boy in a Catholic school the day it happened. Actually had neighbors that were on the grassy knoll and all over who our next door neighbor saw the whole thing. So she, when I became an adult one time, described the whole thing to me. So.
Wow. How old were you at that time again?
I was in kindergarten. I was in a, kindergarten through 12 Catholic school with my two older brothers and sitting there listening to the broadcast when it all came down.
Wow. So your family background, in addition to that traumatic and close kind of memory, but your family background also includes Osage and Sioux ancestry on your father's side. So it's other strong cultural reality. So how much of those cultures, maybe in addition to the Catholic culture, really influenced you as a child?
I think a lot. I think out of being a Catholic young boy, it was, you do right by people. You do the right things. You don't lie. You don't steal. I remember the one time I stole in my life. I found a little record of the Rolling Stones 45 called Get Off of My Cloud. I don't know if you remember that song.
Yes, very much.
Found it in the desk at school. I kept it, and the guilt got to me, and the next day I returned it. That's the one time in my life I stole. So, I was taught all these basic things the Ten Commandments teach you and all that. I was also taught that there's some authoritarian figures that can be pretty wicked. I got many of my nun beatings and those things going on too. So it was odd. But I would say the Indian background came primarily from my great aunts and grandparents. And they were the ones who were really interested in sharing the Indian philosophy and taking me out into the wilderness and doing different things with me. My parents' generation was very interested in assimilating and not being Indian. My dad was a white collar type of guy. He wanted to be a business person and successful. And although he did talk sometimes about being Indian, it wasn't at the same level. So I had a great grandmother, Graham, who was literally there when Wounded Knee went down.
Wow.
And I found that out when I was sitting watching the Mickey Mouse Club. I don't know if you remember that, little boy. And on the TV came the cavalry. And I don't know, it was a Daniel Boone episode or something probably. And this 90-year-old little tiny wrinkled up Indian woman stood up out of her wheelchair and started screaming and spitting at the TV and cussing in Indian and all this. And it really shook me up. And my aunt came and grabbed me and took me in another room, and I was crying. And that's when she told me about some of the things that were done to Indians. And it was like, oh my goodness, I had no clue. The soldiers were not these wonderful heroes that we always thought. But Graham was one of those. What you got from my Indian aunts was unconditional love. We used to go visit 5 aunts, all lived in the same home. They were all widowed, and we called it the ant farm, is what we called her home. And I loved to go to the ant farm because all of a sudden you left this world of, your parents and all that, and you could do no wrong. They were big old chubby Indian women. When they hugged you, you just fell into them like big pillows. And they would sit down and talk to you about their life experiences and what it was like to grow up in that environment. And so when later on I started exploring people and looking for who are the thinkers I want to follow in my life, I ran into this guy named Joseph Campbell, and 2 reasons I connected with him was he loved American Indian mythology, and he was born and raised a Catholic. And he helped bring those 2 different philosophies together, those 2 different ideologies together for me.
So, Cort, do you remember when you had the realization that what you were taught isn't exactly what you believed? So we are conditioned, and all humans, this happens. We do this with all of our kids, and they sort of need to figure out for themselves what they actually believe. But do you remember that moment? Was there a moment where what the term sometimes you hear is where the light came in, where you're like, wait a minute, things aren't what I thought they were?
Well, in my book, I write about some of the conversations I had with my mom when I would get home from school. And my mom taught me that, everyone has their interpretation of events, circumstances. And she always encouraged me to choose the interpretation that best served me. So she would never tell me, this is the way things are, and this is the way you should be, or this is what you should think. She'd share with me her point of view, very honest about it. And then would say, but that's my point of view, Cort. What do you think? So there was a time where, when Nixon was going through the whole Watergate, we had a ton of conversations. And at that point, little kid, I supported the president. You support the president. My mom had a very different point of view. But she never made me wrong for having that point of view.
Did you find that to be a different experience than your friends? The way that, the way they were raised, where they're sort of put in this, they're wrapped in this packaging of a belief system, and then they're condemned if they challenge it. You, on the other hand, like you as you just clearly said, you didn't have that experience. Did you feel like that was different than the experience your friends had growing up?
What I noticed growing up, that I didn't get upset about things that other people around me got upset. I didn't get hooked by events and circumstances the way they did. I just constantly was thinking to myself, why is everyone taking things so seriously and getting so upset and angry about these things? And I think it was because they had their whole belief system and everything was taught was part of their identity. So when you were attacking the way they thought or had a different point of view, you were attacking them. And just like we do in the United States, you can't say anything bad about America, as if you're saying something bad about me.
That's right. Yeah.
So I constantly thought to myself, I don't know if I thought in these words, but today I'd say I'm more mature than these other folks around me. I just constantly felt that way.
Interesting.
I love that you said, your mom, she never made me wrong, is what you said. And it seems as if you were living sort of in between a lot of different worlds, but that you had this ease to kind of float between them. Did you feel like that's something that you were born with, or something that sort of grew out of this experience?
I think it grew out of, I love my parents. I love my relatives, respected them all, and got little bits and pieces for all of them. But my mom was the one who said, it's up to you, Cort, to decide how you put all this stuff together. Because I'd tell her about, Graham took me out and we went out and she had me taste some different plants and, and do all these things. Or Aunt Ruth had me go do this. What do you think, Mom? And she would say, well, that's their background, Cort. And she, what did you learn from that? But she constantly would remind me, that's up to you to decide, Cort. It's not my role to do that.
That's great.
That's why it frustrates me so much to see what's going on in our schools and in our colleges, and so much about people are being told how to thought.
Yes.
How to think and what they should think today, instead of what is it serves you, serves greater good. Because one of the things I've learned, I've traveled all over the world. I've worked on every continent except Antarctica. Been in the jungles of Brazil. I've been all over Africa. I've been over the Middle East, all over America, North and South America. And one thing I realized is there's all kinds of different ways of looking at things. And none of them are necessarily right. And when I was in Saudi Arabia, my feeling was this was their country. Who am I here to judge how they do some things? And there's some things I really liked about Saudi Arabia. One was you never saw crime or felt at risk of any crime. Felt completely safe. Now there's horrible things about Saudi Arabia. I once bumped into a woman in the large black dress in a grocery store, and the driver told me that if anyone would have seen that, she at best would have been beaten severely, and at worst she would have been executed. So, but again, one of the things I decided to do in my life is I'm not going to go around judging how other people think and believe. I want to look at all these. I want to understand why they believe that, how they came to believe that, and then decide for myself what I want to teach to others. And my children, I basically taught them the same thing my mother has taught me. Hey, that's up to you to decide. So I got one daughter and son-in-law. They're extremely into their church and committed to their church and their faith. I got another one who thinks they're crazy, who thinks, I can't believe they believe what they believe. I said, Trent or Charlie, it isn't what they believe. It does them serve them. I always say, whatever gets you to the light is all right. That old Elton John and John Lennon song.
That's right. Yeah.
Great. So it's interesting to me. I don't know, Justin, if you feel the same way, but it's interesting to me too, Cort, that you're such a spiritually aligned person. Like, who you are, and you have this great foundation of non-judgment, but that you went into something very linear for your career, that you chose engineering as a young man. So tell me a little bit about what the impetus for that decision was.
My brother was going to the school I ended up going to, Oklahoma State, and he came home, my older brother, and he said, Cort, they got this unique engineering degree. You go to classes with the chemical engineers and the petroleum engineers and all that, and but there's also this element of safety. And our family owned this safety type business. My dad owned a business that sold safety equipment and safety shoes all over, the Texas and Oklahoma and the Southwest. And so we were in sort of that type of business. And he said, Cort, this is a unique opportunity for the first time in business. They're creating a degree where your job is to look out and take care of people, not just make money. And that appealed to me. Mm-hmm. So I went and got the degree. I made the president's honor roll, never got a B in the whole thing. Absolutely loved it. Mm-hmm. Then I go into industry, and I found that I didn't use any of my engineering degree. I remember calling my dad once and saying, Dad, they expect me to help them figure out how to do all these unbelievably dangerous things we do. I worked in a chemical company, how to do all these things without hurting anybody. Mm. And my engineering background is useless to me unless I want to design, a sprinkler system or a rupture valve or something like that. And he said, well, Cort, you're going to find this whole safety business, this whole role you're playing, it's all about people. Mm. And I said, well, that's wonderful. Because I only had one course about people when I was in college, and it was a 3-hour psychology course. So that conversation set me off on this exploration to try to figure out people and understand people in service of how do I help leaders and supervisors keep their people safe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm curious. You are immersed in these kind of these cultures, that growing up Catholic, the Native American culture was very much a part of your life. Then you get into the corporate culture, and corporate America has its own culture as a total, and then it's certainly got its individual cultures. You had lived in a bit of almost like a split world as a young man, as a child and a young man, and you get into the corporate life. Where did you start to see some of those same splits where the way things were being done was misaligned with what you believed things to be true? What were some of those things that you first remember starting to go, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right?
Well, I found myself being the oddball constantly in my 14-year corporate career from the very beginning. The first day I was on the job, I saw a bunch of contractors entering a huge styrene tank, this huge storage tank. And before I even walked into the office, I walked across the parking lot and walked over there to what they were doing. And I walked up and I said, has anyone tested the atmosphere in there? And they said, no, we don't need to. And they had a good explanation why. And I said, well, I'm telling you to get your butt out of there. And they all got out of there. And I walked in the office. And, in the first 5 minutes, I had a bunch of people wanted to kill me. The maintenance superintendent wanted my head. And
right.
Ultimately, they went and tested the atmosphere, and it was full of nitrogen. Mm. And they had accidentally connected a nitrogen line. So my plant manager, his name was Harold Barber, about 70 years old, wore a gray suit and with a gray tie and a white shirt every day. He was reading his Wall Street Journal every morning. He sat me down and he said, son, don't you ever forget this. Don't you ever keep silent, because you saved 7 lives today. So don't. And from that moment on, I never had a problem speaking up or taking a stand or calling people out and stuff. Because I always thought back to that moment. If I hadn't have spoken up, a lot of men would have died. Mm-hmm.
And how old were you at that time, Cort?
Oh, I was right out of college. I mean, I was probably 22 years old. And I found that in the corporate culture, it's still today. It's no different today. I've, worked in companies approaching 40 years. It's no different today. People want to look good. They want to look good in front of the boss. They want to be seen in a certain way. They're terrified of being called out or embarrassed. I mean, I literally went to work in a company a few years ago, and I said, is there anything I need to understand about your culture? And the first thing was said to me was, don't ever embarrass anybody around here or call anybody out. They'll never forgive you for that. And everyone else in the room was nodding. Said, well, you're going to have real issues with me, because that's what you're paying me to do. And you're paying me a lot of money, and I'm not going to waste a lot of your money and time tiptoeing around things. I'm going to call you out.
Yeah. Love that.
It's so interesting too that people will say that don't do this. And then when you tell them you're direct, like you were, and you said, no, that's what I'm going to do. Suddenly there's this space created for that. And I mean, in some cases, I guess they could have thrown you on your ear, and you've probably had that experience as well. But sometimes just setting that standard or that expectation right from the get-go, it opens up something.
Oh, definitely. You're ever in a coaching relationship, the first thing I encourage people to do, develop a contract, the do's and don'ts.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to interact with each? I call it a social contract.
Mm-hmm.
And with me, part of it is I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'll probably be the only person in your life who does, from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Powerful. So some of those, we already kind of explored some of these paradoxes or contradicting realities that you worked in early in your career. But I mean, are there others, especially in safety at that time, which maybe didn't even exist? The mindset around safety. What were some of those contradictions that you saw?
Oh, there were huge things we're seeing in competition which really aren't in competition. So safety versus productivity, quality versus schedule, all these things we're seeing as competing priorities. And it was funny. I used to go into, when I became an internal consultant in the company, I would go around and meet with senior teams at different facilities, and I would have, I would list quality, safety, productivity, cost, and list those and say, I want you to rank them the way you believe your leadership team ranks them. And then I want you to rank them the way you personally rank them. And invariably, they all put safety first, quality second, all those other things are typically for themselves, they would put them first. For the team, they would put just the opposite first. Yeah. And I learned through that and would talk with them about how is it that all of us who want to go this direction and believe this, when we come together as a team, we believe and act totally different than that. Mm-hmm. And so one of the concepts, and if you're listening to this, watching it, I want to encourage you to look this up. It's called a polarity. Mm-hmm. It's polarity thinking. It was originally used in apartheid in the negotiations in South Africa. But a polarity is two things that seem to be in opposition, but they're actually dependent on each other. Yes. And there's advocates for each side. So there's always advocates I worked with who were more interested in productivity and safety, and there are others that were the other way. What I would help them do is, hey, either side wins, you're both going to lose. We got to figure out what balance looks like, feels like, and give that a name. Mm-hmm. And we're all in service of that. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the most useful tools I ever learned was polarity thinking.
Yeah, it sounds similar to the discipline of third way thinking too, that you are out there, and that's been around a while. It's interesting. I collect. I like to go into vintage stores or thrift shops and finding any business book written before 1970, because that's the year I was born. Mm-hmm. And so I've uncovered a number of like Peter Drucker's early works, and you just go through those, and he speaks like his initial book, his criticism of GM, could have been written by you of some of the companies you've worked with related to their mindset and how they were thinking. And one of the things that he said was devoid in most companies is this third way thinking or objective thinking. He didn't call it polarity thinking, but this idea that there are two sides, and those two sides produce a healthy tension. And if we want to get to an end conclusion, then that's a healthy and good thing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think that, I guess the question behind that soliloquy is that you said earlier that companies really haven't changed in your 40 years. Like company cultures haven't changed. And I guess the question I have for you related to that is, do you think, have you ever seen a company, a full culture turn around, move away from that linear, almost religious type thinking, around the way that the business is supposed to be done, and become a more enlightened company? Have you ever seen it happen?
Not of an entire company, but of certain divisions within a company, projects within a company, absolutely. But moving an entire company, especially companies I've worked with have been these big, huge,
right,
all over the world, 40, 50,000 employees. Mm-hmm. That would require the entire CEO and the board and everyone, and that would require a phenomenal leader to do something like that. Yeah. But definitely, I remember walking into a project where they had just killed 2 people. And this was in Louisiana. And the the culture was terrible. Everybody hated working there. Everybody hated the project manager. They were going to fire the project manager. And I was brought in. I said, look, give me a chance to meet this person. So I sat down with him in his office and had a talk with him about, why are you really here? What are you up to in this world? What is it you're called to do? All those intimate questions that most people have never asked themselves or ever answered. And had about a 4-hour conversation out of that. And out of that, he held these meetings and he pulled everybody in and he essentially put up the numbers, all the statistics. And he said, I want you to tell me what this means. And he brought people in about 20 at a time, and people say, well, it means we suck. It means we're doing terrible. And finally, he would say, I'll tell you what it means. It means one of you is going to die. Another one of you is going to die. And I just went to 2 families and told them. And he told what that experience was like. And what I told him when we were talking is you have to take a stand and declare this is not going to happen anymore. You have to stand for a different future. And he did it as well as anyone could do it with 4 hours coaching. And he said, here's the deal, guys. I want you to leave out of 1 or 2 doors. You go out that door, you keep on going, and thank God bless you, and all the best. If you go out that door, you're with me, and we're going to figure out a way to do this and not hurt anybody else. And to my surprise, he also had them write letters to each other, listening your loved ones, and what you want the project manager to say to them when he goes to your house to tell them you're not coming home. He did all these wonderful things that I hadn't even thought of. And the next, he shut down the project. He put in asphalt parking lot for contractors, which never happens. They put in a car wash so they could wash their trucks. He did all these great things. Long story short, they went another 2.5 years without an incident. And what I learned from those experiences is we're way too emphasis when we're looking at performance on systems and behaviors. Like put in a program, put in a policy. He didn't change any of that. He changed the way people related to him as leader and how they related to each other. They were all looking out for each other and taking care of each other and caring about each other. And that was my first experience with what one leader can do. Now, first thing he had to do was transform himself. Who he was when I walked in that room was, I can't wait to get the hell out of here. You know, this is a terrible project. I got stuck with a real loser. You know, I had to help him face up to, dude, you got 2 deaths on your hands. This is all a reflection of your leadership. And you're gonna bolt. Are you kidding me? Yeah. But he was willing to accept that, allow me to say those things to him, to listen to him, and choose to change.
So you talked about, asking those difficult questions that we mostly avoid. Asking that client, what was he here to do? So for you, you've had a pretty clear mission since early in your career. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and why?
Well, I had an experience where through my actions and decisions, I contributed to a man dying. I literally held his hand as he died and heard his last words. And our plant manager got us all together afterwards and made us answer the question, how did we kill this man? And, I won't tell the whole story. I write about it significantly in my book, but I came to the conclusion we killed him because we didn't care about him because he was a contractor. He wasn't worthy of our concern. And I didn't even think about him when we put him where we put his well-being or safety, like I would my own loved one or any of the people who worked for me. And that woke me up to, and by the way, we had the best safety program in the company. We had the best performance in the company up to that moment. And I realized all of that crap went out the window because of who I was being. It was totally worthless in the hands of someone like me who didn't give a darn about the well-being of these people. And that plant manager made me face up to that. And we ultimately developed a shared commitment. We call it our stand. And the stand is I'm committed to the health, safety, and well-being of the men and women who design, operate, and maintain our world. So the people who get it done every day, anywhere from engineers to janitors to operators to constructors, people with a shovel out there digging the trenches. those people get it done every day. That's my life is committed to them.
Oh, amazing. I think so often, particularly today in our world, that those are unseen individuals, seen but not seen by people, appreciated not really by the greater public. And so without an advocate inside of an organization, I just feel as if those individuals are invisible to most of us a lot of times.
They're valued instrumentally is the way I put it. They're seen as instruments to get work done, to produce results. They're not, and it's okay to value someone instrumentally. You know, the value they bring as an instrument, as an engineer or whatever. But you also have to value them intrinsically. Yeah. You know, they're a human being. And it's the leaders that get both of those that I find are the most effective. But hey, I've worked at places where there have been fatalities, and people have said things like, "Well, he's only an Indian. You know, they're used to dying. You know, over in Saudi Arabia." Or was he one of ours? You know, you hear that on the radio. Nah, it was just a contractor. Oh, well, thank God. You know. Wow. So, talk about forgotten. Yes, they're forgotten. Yeah. You know, the number one way constructors who construct on highways get hurt? People in cars throwing things at them as they go by.
That's disgusting.
Yeah, it's disturbing.
Wow.
So
yeah, they are forgotten. They need an advocate.
Yes.
So in order to do that, to follow this trail for a little bit, in order to not see the humanity of another human requires you to be detached from your own humanity. You know, that you don't see enlightened, self-aware people doing that. They don't overlook people. It's one of the great gifts of what we call an awake leader, is they see everyone. They still have flaws, but they still see the humanity of everyone. So what do you think, and you can go forward to contemporary times of business or in your history of working in and around these leaders for the last 40 years, what causes these leaders to become detached from their own humanity? What are some of the causes of that?
Well, humans are very good at objectifying other human beings.
Yes.
I mean, that's how we get a good war off the ground, right? You know?
That's true.
First, you got to turn the other party into adoptive, and we do it through politics. We do it all kinds of ways. So you have to embrace this idea that I embrace, is that human beings are sacred beings. And this is part of what I learned from my Indian ancestry. These are sacred beings, even the ones that I can't stand,
right?
that I totally disagree with and all that. Whenever I walk into a room to work with people, and I've walked in some rooms where they didn't want me there and they were upset with me, my first challenge is, how am I going to fall in love with these people and see them as sacred beings? So we're really good at that. We've all been brought up and taught that capability of objectifying others. We see it happen constantly. All I got to do is turn on the news. You'll see it happening.
Yeah.
And I don't know many people who go through school and are taught the things that I was taught.
Right.
You know, one of the proudest things one of the things I'm most proud of, my children or grandchildren are getting old enough where my kids are starting to think about, how are we going to school our children? And my son, who sometimes, you know, you wonder, does my son really ever listen to me? What does he really think of me?
Yeah.
He said, well, I don't know what you can do with him, but I'd have him spend a day or two with Dad every month.
Wow.
And that's, you know, I really appreciated him saying that.
Yeah. That's one of those payback moments as a parent. My mom would always talk about that.
And it isn't, I see us teaching people in business and in schools things that they're not really going to need.
Yes.
Like I was taught engineering, never used it. It got me in the door. We sure as heck aren't teaching people how to hold each other as sacred beings, how to deal with each other, how to create a win-win for everyone. All those things that make life, you know, a world a great place to live in.
Well, I think a big portion of this is, by our nature, Americans in particular, we're not a contemplative culture. We're a work culture. We get our value from work. One of the first things you ask a stranger, what do you do for a living? And somebody will get laid off and they'll be like, oh, how tragic, you got laid off, instead of seeing it as an opportunity maybe to do something different. And I was hiking a trail yesterday up called River Place up here in Austin. And I'm sitting journaling, and this man sits down next to me and he goes, do you work here? And I said, no.
He thought you were loafing.
He thought I was working on something, like, because I was journaling. And he goes, do you work? I'm like, no. He goes, oh, you brought your work out here. I said, no, I'm journaling. It's part of having a contemplative life. And I could have told him that aliens give him a million unicorns, and he would have believed that more. And he was like, okay, and he got up and laughed. But I realized in that moment that, imagine, it goes to how often you don't see a lot of inner contemplation. In fact, it's even scorned in corporate America to be too contemplative of yourself and other people's humanity. So I can imagine in the work that you're doing, where you are, when you say the only leader that needs to change is you, and you hold this mirror up to them, and how many of them turn away because they've never looked in the mirror of themselves before. They've always thought it was some outside system or outside situation.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The most common reaction I get when I get a leader, his or her initial feedback, what I say is, I'll go capture the story that goes on about you when you're not around. The most common reaction is devastation. And they use words like that. And I have to remind them, devastating is your child has an incurable disease. This hurts a little. But it tells me they don't ever get this feedback at all.
Yeah.
You were talking about the gentleman in the journal. I was talking one evening with Dr. Deming. I was fortunate enough, Edward Deming, back in the late 80s, early 90s. And he told me a story about when he went to Japan, and he said, in America, when you walk into a person's office, and if they're looking out the window daydreaming, it's okay to interrupt. But if they're having a meeting, it's not okay. If they're having a conversation. In Japan, if they're having a meeting, you can walk in and join the meeting or talk or whatever. But if they're daydreaming, you do not interrupt that, because they see that as very special, very creative time and everything. And that's the way we are here. If you aren't doing something, I have an exercise that is a never fail exercise. And I often do it when I start working with a group of people. And whatever area we're working on in performance, I'll say, I want you to list the recipe for great performance in, drilling or production or safety or quality. If you're writing the books and there's 12 chapters, what are those chapters? And they'll give me a list of things. And then I'll ask them, I want you to put a box around all the things on your list that are objective, observable phenomenon. They're things you could videotape or picture or describe to others. They have dimensions. They exist in time and space. And probably 80-90% of what they put on their list will be those. And then I'll say, now I want you to tell me the difference between all those things on your list that have boxes around them and those that don't. And the things that don't are things like love and passion and caring and concern and leadership and all those touchy-feely things, right? And they'll say, well, these are outside of people. These are, and I'll say, okay, now we're here because we want to improve productivity or whatever it is. We want to build this fab in half the time they've ever built one. Do you think we need more of these things with boxes to get there? And the answer is always no. We got way too much of that stuff. What do you think we need? We need that stuff on the right-hand side. And then I draw a line between the two, and I say, this is the being side of performance, and this is a doing side. And as a culture, we are way overemphasizing the doing side and forgotten all about the being side. And I'm not saying the being's more important, but it needs to be brought to its proper place next to the doing, and understand that who I'm being as I do what I do has as much to do with my performance as what I'm doing. I'll ask people, if you change what you're doing, do you think it'll affect the performance? And their answer is always yes. If you change who you're being as you're going about doing what you're doing, do you think that'll change your performance? And their answer is usually, I don't even understand the question.
Right. Yes, right.
But you've read in my book, you know, the supervisor stood up and they said, "How'd you do this?" He said, "Because I'm a father. I used to be a constructor. Now I'm a father."
Yeah.
He just changed who he was being. These men were his sons.
Right.
And you know what? I don't, my sons don't get hurt.
Yeah, that's right. You take care of your own. Yeah.
And there's this idea that you write about and you talk about quite a bit too, about creating versus preventing. Kind of having that prevention mindset versus having a creative environment, cultural mindset. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, if you think about prevention is trying to avoid typically what we don't want to have happen. It's trying to make go away or not happen what we don't want to have happen. And it's not only not very effective, it's not very much fun, and it's not very inspiring or attractive to people. I mean, who likes to lose weight? You know, it's not inspiring. You don't attract a whole lot of people by saying, "I want to make sure we screw up less than we screwed up last year," which is typically the approach we take in many performance areas. But creating is about bringing into being something that you do want. And the way I always express it is a future that without us being here, without my leadership, if I'm the leader, and without us and what we're going to do here, it would never have existed. And the key skill that the most effective leaders get the performance have isn't that they're at the best at developing systems and controlling people's behaviors. They're the best at articulating a future that people say, "I want to be part of that. And I want to make it happen. And I want it so bad, I'm willing to change."
And is that the hardest thing to do for them, to commit to that change?
Not if you're in the presence of this type of leader. Once when this type of leader gets in front of people and invites them into join me and help me realize my vision, people respond like popcorn. And there's early poppers, and there's late poppers, and then there's the kernels that never pop. The key is to take those early poppers and get them in a position where they can turn around to the people that are sort of on the fence and help them pop. But the leader's job is to do nothing but to continually articulate that future and invite those people and remind people what's possible. So you read in my book, the leadership said, we're going to build this project and we're not going to harm anyone. Or we're going to change the quality of life for the construction worker in the United States. And we're going to do it in a way that shows those SOBs over at the headquarters that it's good for business. I mean, those are the type of things that people say, "I want to be part of that." Because I've been treated like crap my whole career. I've never been able to go into an air-conditioned bathroom once in my career. I got on these 130-degree porta-cans. I want to be part of changing that. All of a sudden, you got a project that outperforms all the others, not because we got in front of them and said, "We got to do things faster," and we got to, but we gave them something to be part of.
I think the surest evidence, just almost anecdotal or observational evidence, Cort, of how right you are about this balancing doing and being, is that despite all this massive over-information that we have, we're in the over-information age now, despite all of the access to knowledge, despite all of the training programs, there still is no success formula. The only success formula that I've ever seen is the formula for selling success formulas. And that happens in, everything from, boardrooms to churches to political parties. But there is no formula for success, but there is a formula for being. And that is to change yourself, to connect to your own humanity. And you've pointed this out in your book and in much of your writings that you've done on your website, that the financial evidence is there if people are willing to take that risk and invest some political capital in particular. So why don't they? This seems so obvious, like even like a modification of your diet. Stop eating fried food, stop smoking cigarettes, and stop, do some just basic things, and you'll extend your life. But you still see people doing the same old stuff they've always done. Why don't, in the case that you see, why don't people actually change? Why don't they do it? The leaders in particular.
Why don't they change? Well, the reason they say no to me is because they're going to have to change if they work with me. I in a sense, scare the heck out of some people.
Sure.
When I'm going to meet with a gentleman tomorrow, and he's going to tell me that I got the wrong people on my board, I got the wrong people on my leadership team, and one of the first questions I'm going to ask him is, who have you been being and what have you been doing that's been attracting the wrong people? And try to get him to realize this is a reflection of your leadership.
Yes.
If they're wrong, it's because of that.
Yeah.
How often in people's lives, by the time they become the people I work with, have they ever had to change?
Right.
Like, really?
Yeah.
Unless you had some significant emotional event like I had, I'm not sure I would have ever changed.
Yeah.
You know, and then as you read my book, I had a bunch of wonderful mentors who saw something in me and nourished it and said, this kid is odd and he's different and he doesn't fit in. And I like that about him, and I'm going to use and develop that in him. If those people wouldn't have run into me, I don't know what I'd have done. I'd probably been selling safety shoes on one of my dad's trucks because I'd have been so miserable. But once I had a mentor and it became, oh, I'm the guy who's going to play this role in the company. You know, I'm the guy who's going to stand up in the meeting and say, you know, this is insane what we're doing here. You know, or I think there's a better way. I enjoyed that role.
Yeah.
But people don't have experience with changing, I don't believe. I have often had people tell me, I've never met anyone like you who's asked me to do the things that you've asked me to do, or asked me the questions you've asked me. And I've been at leadership courses and I've been to all the training the company offers. They never talked about the stuff you're talking about. I said, yeah, because we're going to talk about no one but you.
Right.
There's I think another reason is this: we've been made and convinced to believe that if we just put together systems that control people's behavior, we'll get the performance we want or need. And all you got to do is point out some modern highway where everyone, it's as good a system as there is in the world, and everyone knows how they're supposed to behave, and nobody does it. That doesn't work.
Right.
Because none of the work's been done on the inside of those people where they say, I'm a person who drives safety. I'm a person who follows the rules. That's who I am. That's how I go about my business. And we're a society that expects that of each other.
Right. Right.
You know, I go to the Houston all the time driving on I-10. If I'm going to get the finger, it's not because I'm driving safely. It's because I'm in the way of all those people by driving safely.
Right.
So I think there's a number of reasons, but I think the primary one is it's a first.
Right. People don't have experience with change.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think it's also a symptom of having very comfortable lives and just being very cushioned in what we have to change. And so we don't change unless we are confronted with a traumatic event that forces us basically to change.
I'm very concerned it's going to get worse because the people who are entering the workplace today come from places where they have safe spaces.
Yeah.
Yes. Very. Yeah.
And there's still, despite all the enlightenment in the sense of like all the access to information, there's still not a lot of contemplation going on, not a lot of self-awareness. You know, EQ is like a super hot thing right now. It's like corporate mindfulness, big thing right now. Same old stuff happening every single day. It would be easy to get, at least for me as a Gen Xer in particular, it would be easy to get cynical or hardened to all of this. How do you stay connected to your own humanity, your own soul and heart, Cort, as you do the work you do with your clients? How do you not let it harden you?
Well, I avoid the people that are that way. So I'm very choosy about whom I'm around or what I watch on TV and select to expose myself to. And every morning, the first thing that comes up on my calendar out of my Gmail is a little reminder. It says, remember your stand and plan your day. And I sit there and spend about 5 minutes contemplating my stand and look at my day and say, how can I be in integrity with my stand as I go about what I got to do today, what I'm up to today.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
I think that focus on, and I've been reading about minimalism quite a bit, that focus on a one idea that should or can power your behaviors every day. It forces mindfulness because you're suddenly asked to connect what you're going to do with who you are trying to be in the world. And it's very powerful. And sometimes when I've done that, I'm absolutely surprised to see the thing that I need to do today is nothing that I thought I had to do today. But it's definitely the most impactful thing.
Yeah, I call that staying on mission. So even when I work with a leader who does all the vision work, gets everyone enrolled, they translate that vision into a series of missions, just like we translated Kennedy's vision of going to the moon to all those different missions that got us there. The biggest challenge then is staying on mission because there's so many people and so many things that want to draw you off your mission. And if you're not every morning saying, okay, what is this? I call it a stand, not a mission. What's my stand? Then I'm not doing that. It's not in line with my stand. Why am I even thinking about doing that?
Yeah. It's easy to lose. We want to control so many things, and we forget what we actually have control over. And one of the things that we do have control over are how we prioritize. And if, you know, in the work that we do with brands and the work you do with leadership performance, mission is at the root of it. And because it's really easy to wobble from outside conditions and outside distractions. And almost people make that as an excuse. Well, here's all the reasons I can't change or can't grow a business. It's all these self-imposed limitations because they're detached from their own mission. So
I had evidence of that last week where I spent 3 hours talking about mission and message and what's at the core and why you do what you do, presenting to this group. And at the end, someone who hadn't asked a question and there had been multiple opportunities said, well, I don't get it. What does all of this have to do with marketing? Okay. But we have become so divided between a work self or what we have to do as that work self and the person, which is the same.
One of the reasons I do that doing exercise, I like to do that at the very beginning because it opens up that whole space about being. And people are more in that space than they walk in the room. They're all doers. They're the little doing machines when they walk in the door. That's how we've all been raised, and that's how everything works. You know, one of the first questions I like to ask a leader is, who are you? And you get these blank stares. Said, you don't have a clue who you are? Well, no, I really don't. Are you talking my name? No, who are you? What is it you stand for in this world? These are questions they'd never really asked themselves, but leaders are very clear on that. The other thing I wanted to make sure I talked about, Justin, was you mentioned this fact that there's all this information. Well, my experience is you don't become a leader by having information or learning about leadership. And I work with these companies and they have, you know, they send them to these fancy universities where all these professors who've never led in their life are teaching them all about leadership because they got all the titles and everything behind their name. Of course, they must be an expert. And I'll sit them down and say, so when they come back, how many of them have profoundly changed? Virtually none of them. So, well, you got to have 3 ingredients to develop into what I call an all-in leader. You got to have a challenge, and a huge challenge you've chosen to take on. You know, a dragon you have to kill or a mountain you have to climb. You have to have a commitment to doing. You have to be willing to take the journey, and then you need a coach. And if you look at any movie story that's out there, those 3 ingredients exist in every one of those hero stories, every one of those where they evolve into this great leader. Karate Kid, you can name them all, Star Wars. But in business, we don't see it that way.
Right.
We don't.
It's the essence of sports coaching as well.
Yeah, exactly.
They are not the great coaches, the Coach K's and the Belichick's and the Coach Peterson at UW. those guys,
John
they're
Wooden.
not, John Wooden, yeah, they're not directing people through a set of processes. They're teaching them to go inward and access their own level of performance. And it's like, it's this obsession that people have, again, back to what we were saying, like systems thinking or linear thinking, that there's a process for winning. Well, there isn't. There's just a process for going inward to find out what you're made of. And it's the challenge that you said, the dragon, that's the opportunity to do that most people just don't do. Most people are, I've often said that the greatest addiction we have in this country is to comfort. We're addicted to comfort. We're one click away from whatever we want. Either click in to get something from Amazon or click in our thermostat, whatever. Without discomfort, there is no contemplation that would require you to change. So.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I'm drawing a blank on his name. He was a coach at UCLA and won all those national championships.
John Wooden?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I years ago happened to see him speak, and he talked about the first thing he taught his players was how to put on their socks and tie their shoes.
Yes.
Because that's how champions do it. And that's why I go to the fundamentals when I'm coaching someone. Who are you?
Right.
Let's get clear on who you are and what you are up to in this world, so I know the human being I'm talking with.
Right.
And most of them, their identity is their job.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Or their parent, their family life.
Family.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you see that the definition of being a leader is changing a little bit in over the span of your career? Or do you see any light coming in there?
A little light, but there's a big black hole called corporate thinking, and that sort of sucks it out. So, I spent a couple years in two towers, being an oddball again, and there's nothing but black holes around me who would roll their eyes when I talk, and they see all this stuff as touchy feeling. There's this whole thing about you can't feel at work.
Right.
I've had people tell me you can take your feelings and leave them at the gate or leave them at the front door. And I'll say to them, do you realize everything we do and think is based on how we feel? Mm-hmm. We're feeling beings. Mm-hmm. And if you can't tap into people's feelings, you can't lead.
Right.
But it's unacceptable to feel. I got up once in front of a client and I told a story about my grandson being bored and my son-in-law's reaction. And everyone in the room was just almost sobbing by the end of that story. And I had so many people come up to me saying, I got real uncomfortable when you did that. I don't think there's a place for that at work. And I was just trying to help them understand what it means to be committed to someone and how my son-in-law was so committed to that child. I told the story of observing him with his newborn grandson. But it's just, you can't feel at work. Mm-hmm. You can complain, you can gossip all you want, but feel, like genuinely feel and express those feelings, can't do that.
Crime. It's a crime.
So I keep saying, we just got to grow up.
Yeah. Grow up. Absolutely. So now that you're done, well, at least writing Heroes and Heretics to Heroes, certainly not done with the ideas for sure, but what are you up to? What are you working on now?
Well, I took about 6 months off, and I, had worked a long engagement where I was working about 18 hours or 18 billable days every week. And, every time you work an engagement, you learn a lot. Mm-hmm. And I really learned a lot. So I spent about 6 months integrating all of that into my practice and the process I have. What's, I think, unique about me is I have a process for causing a profound transformation in performance in an organization in any area. Doesn't matter what the area is. But that process requires an extraordinary leader. And I have the means of developing, if I coach that person into playing that role, as what I call an all-in leader. So I've captured and packaged all that. And early next year, I'm going to, get back out in the ball game. And I'm looking for the next individual who comes around the corner and says, "Hey, I'm up to that. I want to play that big game you're talking about playing." The other thing I'm doing, I'm working on two books. One of them is a story about a young boy who goes to live with his grandfather. And his grandfather sort of represents all the men in my life that have made a difference. And it's just a little nonfiction story about this little boy. And then I'm writing another one, which is more out of my frustration. The working title is America the Wasteland. And I don't know if you know what I mean by the term of wasteland, but it's sort of barren.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Despite all we have, we're pretty barren. And the idea is, what if an alien was sent here every 100 years to check on us? What would his or her or its report say? Someone who has no biases, who's looking at this from a totally foreign point of view, what would they think about us, and how might they say that? And so somehow I figured out how to have a human being get a hold of this aliens report.
That's great.
Awesome. I can't wait to read
fascinating. Yeah, I'm looking forward to both of them.
And they're both indicative of why we do, why we like you, but also why we do this. Is that it's those fresh takes. There's so many karaoke singers, so many cover bands. So that you're working on things that are original and of the soul, and they're not, well, I got to write a second book because that's what you're supposed to do. You're doing it your intention is as an expression of what you believe. It's part of your being, not just your doing, as it were. I find that to be remarkably refreshing. I'll just say it that way.
Thanks. Yeah. And I enjoy the heck out of it. I love to write.
That's great. So the definition of synthesis that we use is the combination of diverse concepts into a higher stage of truth. So as we kind of wrap up our discussion today, what's one truth that you've learned in life or your career that still guides you today?
Well, I said it earlier, the human beings are sacred beings, and everyone deserves to be loved. And even when I started to learn about great leaders, even when you're fighting the good fight and attacking your enemy, if you look at all these soldiers that survived the worlds, what they said was, that was a sacred being I was combating over there. And these moments were sublime, they were, even when you have to do those difficult things, I think you're still dealing with a sacred being. Interesting. And people get it when they get that I'm in the presence of someone who sees me as sacred. I don't know if you remember in my book, I learned this from the Indians and Pakistanis over there in Saudi Arabia, who walked up to me and were bowing to me. And I asked the interpreter, why are they doing this? And he said they're acknowledging the divinity in you. I said, they think I'm a god? And he laughed and he said, only a Westerner, only American would think, ask, am I a god? He goes, no. He goes, no, they know we all are.
Yes.
And I just love that.
Yes. That's a beautiful thing.
It's beautiful.
So, Cort, as we wrap up here, you're a prodigious and proficient producer of original content. So we would just say to our listeners, you can find Cort at cortdial.com, C-O-R-T dial, D-I-A-L. Also on Twitter, Instagram. Cort, you have an awesome e-newsletter, and it comes out of your recent content. I love how you inject humor into what you do. So for those of you listening, you need a little injection of humor. Cort has the funny story or cartoon of the month that he uses to sort of poke at conventional wisdom, like any good heretic does. So, we just would strongly recommend that this is a genuine thought leader that is worthy of your time and attention of the things that Cort is producing.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. We put a lot of effort and thought into the things we put out there.
Beautiful.
And it shows.
And it does, yes.
Cort, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This is fun.
I enjoyed it.
We could have gone on and on, but we got to stop. So.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.